In the 1950s and 60s, the world was terrified of the Soviet Union. To the West, it was an unstoppable monolith, a machine that had industrialized in a generation, defeated the Nazis, and beaten the Americans into space. But behind the missiles and the propaganda, the gears were already grinding to a halt. The Soviet economy didn't die in a sudden explosion. It died quietly from 1,000 small wounds. It was a victim of its own rigid logic, a system that could build a nuclear submarine but couldn't produce a reliable refrigerator or a loaf of bread without a 3-hour line. At the heart of the Soviet experiment was Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. In a capitalist system, the market decides what to build based on what people want. In the USSR, a handful of men in Moscow decided everything. They set targets for 24 million different products. They decided how many nails a factory in Vladivostok should produce, how much steel a mill in Ukraine should smelt, and the price of a liter of milk in Estonia. The fundamental flaw was information. It is mathematically impossible for a central committee to process the billions of daily micro-decisions that a market handles naturally. By the time the 5-year plan was printed, it was already obsolete. The Soviet Union was trying to run a 20th century economy on a 19th century feedback loop. Because there was no profit motive, the state used quotas. But how do you measure a quota? If the state measured a nail factory by the number of nails, the manager made millions of tiny useless pins. If they measured by weight, he made a few giant heavy spikes. This led to the gross output paradox. Factories met their targets on paper, but the goods they produced were often garbage. Because the state was the only buyer and the only seller, there was no competition. If your TV exploded, a common occurrence in the USSR, you couldn't buy a different brand. You just waited 5 years for a new one. By the mid-1960s, the heroic era of Soviet growth was over. Enter Leonid Brezhnev. His reign from 1964 to 1982 is known as the Zastoy, the stagnation. The USSR had hit a wall. In the West, the third industrial revolution, computers and electronics, was beginning. But the Soviet system was designed for the second industrial revolution, coal, steel, and heavy machinery. The state couldn't handle the decentralization that computers required. Computers require the free flow of information. The Soviet Union was built on the control of information. They saw the PC as a threat, a printing press in every home. So they stifled the very technology that could have saved their economy. In the late 1960s, it looked like the Soviet Union had found a miracle. Massive oil and gas fields were discovered in Siberia. Just as the internal economy was rotting, the global price of oil skyrocketed due to the 1973 energy crisis. Suddenly, the Kremlin was flooded with petrodollars. This was the worst thing that could have happened. Instead of fixing the broken factories or reforming the farms, the leadership used the oil money to buy what they couldn't make, food and technology from the West. Oil became the Soviet Union's life support. It allowed the old guard to ignore the rot for another 15 years, but they were now hostage to a price they couldn't control. Perhaps the greatest failure was in the fields. Russia had once been the breadbasket of Europe. Under the system of collectivization, the incentive to work was killed. The state allowed peasants to keep tiny private plots for their own use. These plots made up less than 3% of the land, yet they produced nearly 30% of the country's meat, milk, and vegetables. It was a glaring, embarrassing proof that the system didn't work. By the 1970s, the superpower that sent men to the stars couldn't feed its own people. They began importing millions of tons of grain from their arch-rival, the United States. There was one sector that the Soviets never cut corners on: the military. To keep up with the United States in the Cold War, the USSR poured an estimated 15 to 25% of its GDP into the military. For comparison, the US spent about 6%. The Soviet military-industrial complex was a state within a state. It got the best scientists, the best steel, and the best electronics. But this was a parasitic relationship. The military was sucking the lifeblood out of the civilian economy until there was nothing left but husks. Because the official economy failed to provide, a parallel economy emerged. It was called blot, a system of personal connections and favors. Everyone in the USSR had a guy for meat, a guy for shoes, a guy for medicine. This wasn't just a black market, it was the only thing keeping the country running. By the 1980s, the shadow economy was estimated to be as large as 20% of the official GDP. The people had checked out of communism long before the government did. By 1980, the Soviet Union was a giant leaning on a brittle cane. It was still a superpower on paper, but its internal organs were failing. In this decade, the quiet death of the economy would be accelerated by a trio of disasters: a war it couldn't win, a reactor it couldn't contain, and a commodity price it couldn't protect. In December 1979, the Kremlin made a fateful decision to invade Afghanistan. They expected a quick victory. Instead, they got a 10-year quagmire that became the Soviet Vietnam. Afghanistan was a massive drain on an already exhausted treasury. It wasn't just the cost of the bullets and the fuel, it was the cost of supporting a puppet regime and the loss of labor as thousands of young men were sent to the front. At its peak, the war was costing the USSR billions of rubles a year, money the civilian economy desperately needed for modernization. The war also triggered Western sanctions and a new arms race. President Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program, SDI, forced the Soviets to spend even more on high-tech defense research they couldn't afford. The military-industrial sinkhole was getting deeper. Throughout the 1970s, high oil prices had acted as a glamorous mask for Soviet inefficiency. But in 1985, the mask was ripped off. Saudi Arabia increased production, and the global price of oil collapsed. Almost overnight, the Soviet Union's main source of hard currency vanished. They had become oil addicts, and the world had just cut off their supply. Without oil revenue, they couldn't buy the foreign grain needed to feed their people, or the Western machinery needed to keep their factories running. This was the true beginning of the end. The Soviet Union was essentially a giant company town, where the company's only profitable product had just lost 2/3 of its value. They were forced to start borrowing from Western banks, racking up a massive foreign debt that would eventually paralyze the government. For years, the leadership of the USSR was a gerontocracy, a government of the old. Between 1982 and 1985, 3 general secretaries died in quick succession. The country was drifting, led by men who were physically and ideologically incapable of change. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, he was the first leader born after the Russian Revolution. He knew the economy was dying. He knew the quiet death had to be stopped. He introduced 2 words that would change the world: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Just as Gorbachev was beginning his reforms, the unthinkable happened. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Chernobyl was more than a human and environmental tragedy. It was an economic catastrophe. The cleanup and the construction of the sarcophagus cost the Soviet Union roughly 18 billion rubles, roughly the entire annual budget for healthcare or education. Chernobyl broke the myth of Soviet technical superiority. More importantly, it forced the government to be open, glasnost, about its failures.
Once people saw how incompetent the state was at managing a power plant, they began to question how it managed everything else, including their bank accounts. One of Gorbachev's first moves to fix the Soviet worker was a massive anti-alcohol campaign. He saw that alcoholism was destroying productivity and life expectancy. He closed distilleries and hiked prices. It was a disaster. Not only did people start making dangerous moonshine, samagon, but the state lost one of its biggest sources of tax revenue, the vodka monopoly. The government's budget deficit exploded. Gorbachev had tried to save the people's health, but he had inadvertently bankrupted the treasury. Gorbachev's economic reform, perestroika, was meant to introduce a little bit of market into the socialist system. He allowed factories to keep some of their profits and gave individuals the right to form small cooperatives. This created the worst of both worlds. The central planning system was dismantled, but a real market hadn't been built to replace it. Supply chains collapsed. Factories didn't know who to sell to. The quiet death was now becoming a very loud, chaotic breakdown. Perestroika was like taking a car that's traveling at 60 miles per hour and trying to change the engine while it's still moving. The old system was broken, but the new system didn't have any roads to drive on. Inflation began to spiral, and for the first time in decades, people saw the value of the ruble vanish. By the late 80s, the economic crisis was no longer a matter of data, it was a matter of survival. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Sugar, soap, and cigarettes were rationed. The Iron Curtain was now a shortage curtain. The social contract of the Soviet Union, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, had finally snapped. The government was still paying the people, but the rubles were useless because there was nothing left to buy. By 1988, the quiet death of the Soviet economy had become a public funeral. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had intended to give the system oxygen. Instead, they acted as a solvent, dissolving the glue that held 15 disparate republics together. For 70 years, that glue was fear and central planning. Now, both were gone. Economic stagnation triggered ethnic and nationalist movements. The republics realized that Moscow was no longer a provider, it was a parasite. The wealthy Baltic states in particular saw their high-quality goods being siphoned off by the Kremlin to prop up failing regions, leaving their own store shelves empty. The economic crisis led to what we call the War of Laws. Republics began to pass legislation declaring that their local laws took precedence over Moscow's. More importantly, they stopped sending tax revenue to the central treasury. The Soviet Union was literally running out of money because the provinces had gone on strike. In a desperate attempt to keep the peace, the Kremlin did the one thing every failing government does: they printed money. In 1986, the budget deficit was 5 billion rubles. By 1989, it was over 100 billion. This created a phenomenon known as hidden inflation. Prices were officially controlled by the state, so they couldn't rise. Instead of higher prices, people got longer lines. The ruble became a wooden currency, worthless for anything other than starting a fire. By 1990, the Soviet Union had reverted to a barter economy. Factories were paying their workers in the goods they produced. A light bulb factory paid in light bulbs. A tractor factory paid in scrap metal. The modern economy had collapsed back into the Middle Ages. In a final, desperate move, a group of radical economists proposed the 500 Days Plan. It was a shock therapy blueprint to pivot the entire USSR to a market economy in less than 2 years. Gorbachev hesitated. He tried to compromise between the hardline communists who wanted to return to the iron fist and the radicals who wanted total capitalism. In trying to please everyone, he pleased no one. The plan was rejected, and the last window for an orderly transition slammed shut. As the central government weakened, power shifted to the Red Directors, the men who ran the massive state enterprises. They realized the state was dying and began spontaneous privatization. They essentially stole the assets they were supposed to manage, setting up private shell companies to sell state resources, oil, timber, gold, to the West for personal profit. This was the birth of the Russian oligarchs. These men weren't entrepreneurs, they were looters. They stripped the copper wiring out of the Soviet giant while the people were still inside the building. The economy didn't just die, it was carved up while the heart was still beating. On August 19, 1991, hardline members of the KGB and the military attempted a coup. They wanted to roll back the clock and restore the old economic order. But you cannot restore a ghost. The coup failed in 3 days, but in those 3 days, the authority of the Soviet state vanished completely. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, emerged as the real power. He didn't just want to reform the Soviet Union, he wanted to end it. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a hunting lodge. Over a series of tense meetings and a fair amount of vodka, they signed the Belovezha Accords. They declared that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality, had ceased to exist. There were no riots that night, no grand battles. The superpower that had once terrified the globe disappeared with a whimper. The economy had been dead for years. Now the paperwork was finally caught up. This is the final installment of the documentary script. This section focuses on the immediate agonizing aftermath of the collapse, the wild 90s, the rise of the oligarchs, and the final synthesis of why the Soviet economic model was a terminal experiment.
When the Soviet Union officially dissolved on December 25, 1991, many in the West expected a sudden burst of prosperity. They believed that if you simply removed the iron hand of the state, the invisible hand of the market would take over. They were wrong. The Soviet economy hadn't just died, it had left behind a hollowed-out shell that was about to be devoured from the inside. In January 1992, the new Russian government launched shock therapy. They lifted price controls on almost everything. The goal was to let prices reach their true market value. The result was a hyperinflationary explosion. Prices rose by 2,500% in a single year. Lifetime savings were wiped out in weeks. For the elderly, who had spent 40 years working for the Soviet dream, the transition to capitalism felt like a state-sponsored robbery. Shock therapy assumed there were market institutions ready to catch the fall, but there were no banks, no contract laws, and no competition. There was only the old Soviet monopoly. When you lift prices in a monopoly, the price doesn't go to market level, it goes to whatever the monopolist wants. To move the economy into private hands, the government issued vouchers to every citizen. These were meant to be used to buy shares in state factories. It was supposed to be people's capitalism. Most Russians didn't understand what a share was. They were hungry and desperate. Smarter, better-connected men, many of them former KGB officers or Red directors, bought up millions of these vouchers for pennies. By the time the auctions were over, the wealth of a superpower had been concentrated in the hands of a few dozen men. The final nail in the coffin of people's capitalism was the loans for shares scheme. The Russian government was broke and facing a tough election. A group of new bankers offered to lend the government money. The collateral? The crown jewels of the Soviet economy, the oil, gas, and nickel companies. The government defaulted on the loans as planned, and the bankers took ownership of the companies for a fraction of their value. In one stroke, the Soviet Union's industrial legacy was privatized into a new aristocracy, the oligarchs. The economic death of the Soviet Union had a physical toll. In the 1990s, Russian life expectancy for men plummeted to just 57 years, lower than in many developing nations. Stress, alcoholism, and the collapse of the healthcare system created a demographic hole that Russia is still trying to fill today.
The quiet death of the economy had become a literal death for millions of its citizens. Why did the Soviet economy die? It wasn't just a lack of money, it was a lack of feedback. A market economy is a conversation between millions of people. A command economy is a monologue by a dictator. The Soviet Union spent 70 years talking to itself, ignoring the reality of its own inefficiency until the reality became too loud to ignore. They built a system that valued quantity over quality, stability over innovation, and the state over the individual. When the world changed, moving from the age of steel to the age of information, the Soviet machine simply didn't have the parts to adapt. Today, the ghost of the Soviet economy survives in the state capitalism of the 21st century. The lessons of its collapse serve as a warning. No amount of military might or natural resources can save a system that refuses to let its people participate in the creation of value. The Soviet Union didn't lose the Cold War on a battlefield. It lost it in the grocery store, in the factory, and in the ledger. It was a giant that rusted from the inside out until one day there was nothing left but rust.